Today we have an excellent panel lined up for you today, the ticking time bomb, youth and gender issues. This is an issue that is very close to my heart, close to my research interests, and I'm excited to introduce some of the foremost experts in the field. First, I will start out with a small introduction to the key issues, and then we will move forward. The Gulf states have reached a critical demographic juncture, management of which will determine their political and economic stabilities for decades to come. Women represent over half the society, and the youth are the largest sector of society. Both will be entering the workforce imminently. The potential productivity of this impending workforce allows for a unique demographic dividend that could be politically and economically rewarding if the correct institutions and policies are in place. To move forward and embrace an innovative human capital, economic changes must be accompanied by social change that frees dynamism and encourages innovation by their peoples. This will not be easy. Tensions are inevitable, as change is uncomfortable, especially for those who fear the old ways may be slipping away. As women reach historic milestones, how will traditionally conservative Gulf societies grapple with the consequences of inevitable emancipation of women? The Gulf's large youth bulge continues to gain access to education. However, the labor markets have failed to produce career opportunities in the private sector, matching the raised expectation of the region's youth. How can Gulf leadership and institutions satisfy those expectations in the context of inevitable economic, political, and social change? On that note, I would like to introduce to you our distinguished panel. We start out with Dr. Kristin Diwan. Dr. Dhawan is a senior resident scholar at Arab Gulf States Institute in Washington. Her research focuses on generational change and the evolution of Islamism in the GCC. She has held various academic positions at American University, George Washington University, and Georgetown University, and she holds a PhD in political science from Harvard. She's very popular among the youth in the Gulf. They all know her personally. And she will be addressing youth movements and policy recommendations for dealing with the large youth populations across the region. Maggie Salem, she is the executive director of Qatar Foundation International, and she has a long history of experience with the Middle East. Most notably, Ms. Salem has worked with the U.S. Department of State, where she served as a diplomat, also Special Assistant to Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, which I'm sure you all know, and Assistant to Ambassador Martin Indyk at the U.S. Embassy in Tel Aviv, Israel, which we saw him this morning. She will discuss opportunities and challenges associated with education and the development of human capital in light of the growing youth entering the private sector. Dr. Auhoud Albulushi, and since I was raised here, I always mispronounce her name, and I apologized in advance for it. She's an Omani academic and researcher with a multidisciplinary background in linguistics, sociology, and law. And we all would like to congratulate her because she just finished her second master's in law with a focus of international law and commercial law. She will evaluate the general status of women across the Gulf. Miss Jane Kinninmont. She is the head of programs at the Elders Foundation. Prior, she was a senior research fellow and deputy head of Middle East and North Africa's program at Chatham House. She has held previous positions focused on economic and political issues of the Middle East, most notably The Economist and Business Monitor International. She will be talking about the future of women activists in the Gulf. So please join me in welcoming our distinguished panels. And I will pass the baton on to Dr. Diwan.
Thank you. Thank you, Dania. I think I've taught a lot of the Gulf youth, which may be one reason why I've, as a professor, so maybe I've had some great contacts in that very direct way, which is one of the best ways, I think, to get to know people and to know, as I'm looking at Professor Gerd Noneman here too, I know he's going to agree with me when you're in a classroom with students, you get to have exceptional conversations, including with Dania. Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm very happy to be here to reflect on this moment of incredible transition in the Gulf. And I feel like, I've been working on the Gulf for probably 20 years. It seems like the Gulf is always in transition. And of course, this is because it's an area of really rapid social and cultural change. But I think right now, the political dynamics are such that we are really seeing a number of interconnected fundamental shifts. And a lot of the drivers of this change have been discussed already earlier today. You could look on the geopolitical level of sort of the weakening to some degree or greater distrust of the US security umbrella, accompanied by greater power sharing in the region and what that means in terms of the competition amongst the states in the region. You could talk about shifts in oil markets, the fracking revolution, what this kind of means in terms of the position of the Gulf, the greater imperative, of course, which has always been there, of economic diversification. We could talk about social changes, and I know Maggie's going to address the issue of education, which is such a key one for all of the Gulf states. All of these things, factors, interact in complex ways, but I continue to be convinced that one of the big drivers of change that we've seen, particularly in this decade, is really the issue of generational change in the Gulf states. And to make that contention, I kind of need to make the case that there's something different or important about this generation, right? Because you could always be talking about generational change. But I think it's the case that actually all generations aren't alike, and all generations don't have the same kind of political significance. I mean, you have certain historic moments or certain demographic shifts that count politically more than others. And I can say that as a member of Generation X, stuck between, kind of lost between the boomer generation and the millennials, to tell you that, some generations kind of on these kinds of big political issues don't count as much as others. And I think in the Gulf, the current crop of 20 and 30-year-olds, or I guess we could call them millennials, that are entering into public life. First off, it's important to note that this is the largest demographic cohort. They're more numerous than those that came before, looking at it in generational cohorts, and more numerous than those coming after. So this is exactly this point where this bubble is crossing, so that we have kind of the most intense kind of intensification of a large generation moving into that public space and seeking jobs and recognition and all of those things and participation. Also, which is really key, I think the main key thing is that this is a generation that's completely shaped by this transformation in the information environment in the Gulf. And here I'm talking about a whole slew of things that all of us have lived through, whether you're talking about web-based applications like YouTube, phone technologies, WhatsApp, social media. This is, of course, a global phenomenon. It is not specific to the Gulf at all. And if you're tracking the kind of changes that you see in the Gulf, they do share a lot in common with a lot of the shifts that we see and a lot of conversations that we would have even about changes that are happening here in the United States as well. But I think it's important to look at this as being particularly impactful in the Gulf states for a couple of reasons. One, just the easy accessibility of these technologies within the Gulf states. These are wealthy states. They're well endowed in terms of their infrastructure. A lot of people use all of these different kinds of, the technology is not a problem. The barrier to entry is very low. Also, due to previous limitations or limitations that exist in the public sphere, then there's a special attraction to having this kind of different alternative public forum, whether it be for discussion or for entertainment or these sorts of things. And I think those two things come together, we can see it's the case, to show that the Gulf states are consistently amongst the highest users of a lot of these different medium, in the world. If you look at the numbers, they're consistently really high up there when you're looking at the penetration of Twitter or YouTube, these kinds of things. There's lots of sociocultural implications that we could talk about regarding this. I'm going to focus a little bit more, or kind of slant it more towards the political implications, which also have been quite significant. And when we do that, I mean, a lot of these things are probably pretty obvious, but just to lay them on the table, what does this shift in the information environment of this very important cohort moving into kind of this public realm do? I mean, one, obviously, it allows for new avenues for self-expression. And I think this is something that we see as being particularly relevant to kind of the millennial generation and this generation in the Gulf. I mean, we have this if you look in the United States too, in terms of the characteristics of millennials, kind of the craft movement, these sorts of things that happen. You have some of those same trends in the Gulf, so this need for kind of self-expression, which again, given in sort of the very tight social and communal environment of the Gulf, where families, society, all these restrictions, it's again kind of interesting to see this new mode for some kind of more personal self-expression. Also new means for interconnection, especially across political divides. And this is really significant, I think, when we see the emergence then of youth as a political actors, in the sense that this technology, at least in some of the initial stages, and we can talk about where this is breaking down, allowed for kind of conversations, people to meet up, to find like-minded personalities that were living in areas distinct from them. And in fact, when I was doing a lot of research on youth activists, you could see these people connecting across Gulf states. It wasn't just limited within a state. Within Saudi Arabia, very interesting to see people across different regions that hadn't kind of connected before, these sorts of things. And so obviously that kind of facilitates new modes of mobilization as well. I don't want to run out of time to get the main things out, so I won't spend too long on the history, but just to make the quick history, you could really see this starting to have a political impact by the mid-2000s, so this is before 2011, I have to say. Most overt would be the Orange Movement in Kuwait, which pushed for changes in electoral districts, which was organized a lot through sort of chat rooms. But you could also see other things happening in the other states as well, online fora in Bahrain, blogs by new generation Muslim Brotherhood activists in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. And eventually then, a lot of these different groups came together, and it was these same youth constituencies that really pushed the significant mobilizations that we saw in the Gulf states in the Arab Spring in 2011. So then let me turn a bit to how the Gulf states have dealt with this new political mobilization. One thing that, obviously we all know happened was, at least with the initial uprisings, was a considerable use of repression. We could talk about this most significantly, of course, with the crackdown in Bahrain. But also we saw kind of a lot of new legal forms being used, which kind of took place over time with kind of the shifting of the legal environment and ways to deal with some of these kind of more serious kind of political protests that were taking place, so that we see kind of arrests and prosecutions happening later over time, so that even just more recently then we've seen those sorts of things happening in Kuwait with the case of the occupation of the parliament, and of course in Saudi Arabia with the arrest of both Islamist and women activists happening much more recently. What's important to think about all of this activism, and we could talk about the different dynamics about that and how it was received in societies and where these activists kind of fit within that. But overall, these kinds of movements, as well as just the broader entry of a lot of young people into the social media realm and the demands that they were pushing for, really forced these governments to recognize youth as their own category, I would argue, and engage with them as youth. So you may have seen, previously in the Gulf, this is kind of a way that Gulf states often deal with different populations, dealing with different groups, whether it be tribal groups, business interests, key people. Now you see the government dealing very much with youth as their own sort of category, right? And I think it's important to recognize that the response was really substantive. I don't think it would be fair to say that this has just been kind of something that's just for cover. I think the message really was brought across that they need to pay more attention to these communities and the demands that are really demands of what the Gulf states need to do to make it, to be successful in a kind of transformation, both in their economies and opening their societies and politics as well. I'll just name a few things. I mean, you saw sort of reorganizations very much of youth ministries to try to use them in different ways. Previously, a lot of the youth ministries, it kind of were pretty much just taken up by pretty poorly run kind of sports ministries. So they were trying to kind of then target kind of a more diverse kind of interest that young people would have in their needs. You also had a flood of kind of youth-targeted initiatives. Some of these come in with the same sorts of transformation and vision plans that we have, but with this special emphasis on small and medium enterprises and entrepreneurship. I know I've visited before the Qatar Incubation Center, some more kind of bottom-up initiatives, such as the Sirdab Lab in Kuwait, which is also kind of one for technology kind of incubators. The other thing we see very much across the Gulf, too, is this new interest and facilitation of arts and entertainment, right? And this is most prominent, I would guess, in Saudi Arabia, where we definitely hear a lot about the General Entertainment Authority and what they're trying to do in opening this very new space in Saudi Arabia for people to participate and have fun in a public, more public setting. Also very serious kind of arts enterprises as well. Really providing some avenue for self-expression that we were talking about before. While it's kind of more known, I guess, gets more attention in Saudi Arabia, of course, we have UAE was kind of more of a leader. In fact, Saudi Arabia is probably following them in this through different enterprises like the 2454, which kind of educates people in using film and different sorts of expression. As well as, I know Qatar as well has a lot of different arts initiatives, and you can even see the new museums that were built in Kuwait, kind of, and the parks that were built in demand for this kind of more public space. There's a question, will these sorts of initiatives be enough? And I think for then, we'll probably be looking at with some of the other people that will be looking at this. Ultimately, I think these social openings are significant, the kind of cultural shifts that have taken place. But ultimately, it depends as well on the successive economic transformations as well, because these are the same generation of people that are going into job markets. They still want to work. And the surveys show, even though there is kind of this interest in arts and kind of new creative fields, and they're opening up these avenues for them, the incentives aren't necessarily fully there yet, and young people still want to work in the public sector, even with all of these shifts in culture and these sorts of things. So that's going to be obviously a big challenge, which I know everyone addresses continually in the Gulf states, because it's just a problem of the oil economy and the way the incentives are set up. The other thing that we can see is that the wealthier states will probably do better with this. Because they have more resources to throw at this, the issues are kind of less urgent. But the poorer states or the larger states, states like Saudi Arabia and even perhaps Oman, are going to wrestle a lot more with meeting both the economic challenges and these kind of cultural shifts, I think, at the same time. And we can see sort of new political forms emerging to engage and try to keep the loyalty and attachment and allow for some space of engagement of these youth populations, underneath the sort of authority of the government and ruling families. And I don't want to go, I'm probably out of time, right? Almost. Well, I'll just run that into another issue, which I spend quite a lot of time thinking about and looking at. One of the forms that we see then for really keeping this attachment, of course, is this this new development of nationalism. This, again, is a global phenomenon. It's not just in the Gulf, but it's particularly evident in the Gulf because I think nationalism was really not something that has been one of the primary identities in Gulf states. In fact, they probably didn't really prefer to have a sort of nationalism. So this is quite a new technique for trying to find some way to meet some of, well, not really the needs, but the political expression of people and to keep them within this contained, I guess. It's very evident, you know, in a lot of the actions that have been taken. And of course, as you combine this with the kind of the greater assertion of powers in the region, the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, and the Yemen war. Of course, in the Qatar conflict, this is very evident in both states, the kind of new nationalism, and the way that that interacts with social media is a really important phenomenon to watch. And to some degree is a very concerning one. You can see a lot of populist overtones coming in this, often in some countries where that can be expressed, a lot of anti-immigrant, migrant kind of things like we would have even here. Again, there's some overlap with other global phenomenon. And just it's something for the US to start to think about, because I think we've dealt with these states for a very long time, like we can deal with just the leaders of these states, right? One-to-one, this is kind of how we manage these things. But to the degree that the states are now starting to mobilize their own populations behind the decisions that they're making and getting this very concrete link that they're making through social media and these things, we're going to see a very different kind of political dynamic open up. And I think we can already see that in a lot of these crises that we're trying to deal with. So I think that's going to be one thing that we'll have to be paying a lot of attention to.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Diwan. I just want to make a note. If you have questions, please write them up so we can get them up here very efficiently. So we basically have established that the youth are recognized as their own category by their respective governments. Let's now see how their energy can be harnessed in a manner that can produce the human capital necessary for thriving private sectors across the region. And that task is given to Maggie.
Hi, good afternoon. Thank you. That is quite a task. So, like anyone well-trained in dealing with such things, you answer the question you want, not necessarily the question you were given. I hope to still be able to answer that question, but maybe it will be a bit oblique, but maybe not too oblique. So a couple of things. First, if we're looking short and medium term, we might actually know what it looks like to go into the private sector, right? Because we understand the nature of jobs today. But we're already living in a world where we don't know what that could look like in 20 years. So short and medium term, we might have some fixes to educational systems, some ideas on how to engage young people more productively in education, having education be tailored better to meet those needs of the workplace. But to me, and I will talk a little bit about that from my perspective, but to me, the more interesting question is, what do you do with a 3-year-old today? So someone who hasn't started school. And what does their senior year in high school look like? I mean, if you could really just imagine that. Because that is what needs to, while we think of all of these short and medium term fixes, some of them are Band-Aids, some of them are more systemic. That's a greater question. And that is a question that someone should be asking in most governments, all governments. The Gulf isn't the only one with a problem. Other systems have problems with declining numbers of young people as opposed to increasing numbers of young people, and that's its own issue. So specifically for the Gulf, and let me deal with that, I don't know, to me more interesting because it's more futuristic idea of what is work. What is a private sector employee expected to do? Are we talking entrepreneurs in business? What kind of businesses are we looking at? And because I can't answer these questions for you, we all know or fear automation and other things that might happen in 20 or 25 years. So I would like to connect that longer-term challenge to a medium and short-term challenge that people are actually working on today. And it is, what kind of kid do you want to produce? Are we really just producing someone who is going to be an entrepreneur building their own business or working in whatever high-tech factory exists to produce all this automation? Or are we producing human beings of the future with longer and longer lifespans, and all of us somehow have to figure out how to get along? And I would argue that task of all of us not killing each other is perhaps the primary task. And you may now think that I'm embarking on some sort of incredibly wish-washy, peacenik sort of thing, and I'm not, although that sounds wonderful, but that's not me. What I will tell you is that movements today that are focused on global education and more specifically on global competency, on producing skill sets. There are 4 key skill sets for any of you who are not as deeply immersed in this environment as I have become. And they are things that when you hear them, you will say, oh, those are good things. Creativity, collaboration, critical thinking, and there's a 4th C, communication. That's right. So wouldn't we all like kids to have skills that look like that? It turns out that employers today often employ people who don't have a skill set they need. They have those other skills, what are called soft skills. Those are the 4 that I articulated. And they do that because you can teach people a lot of things. You can probably teach a person how to make the widget. You can't teach them how to deal with the person who's sitting next to them, who may be in hijab, who may have come from another culture, and to be able to get along with them. Building teams, turns out, is the most difficult thing for employers today. It's hard for people to be on teams. You know, that whole there's no I in team thing. So to me, getting back to the fundamental question you asked, we need to look at education in a very different way. We need to look at who we're trying to produce, not what we're trying to get them to do. If you get the who right, the what will come. There are training programs. There's other ways of addressing the what. And to me, I would much rather focus on the person that we graduate and hand that diploma to and what they're able to do in the world, whether it's at Oracle or at Sears, which won't exist anymore, or at some other establishment. The person gets lost in all of this. It gets lost in the test scores. It gets lost in conversations with administration and infrastructure. And I, again, would say to you that is not a fuzzy goal. It's a very concrete goal. All you have to do is ask OECD, the Asia Society, and others who have been working on this now for close to a decade. Harvard's Project Zero, has been working on this. This is not fuzzy. This is very real. There's even data. I know people get very excited by data. I'm sorry, I don't have any. But the data, it seems, is good because they keep getting money to do more of this work. And the OECD just included global competency on the most recent PISA. So I think we're off to the races. It seems that the person we turn out may be more important than the scores and their ability to code. Can I be daring enough to say that their ability to code may not actually be so important to the future of work? Their ability to do the work on a team. So I'm going to throw all that at you, and you can mull that. It is 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And so back to something more specific to the Gulf. And it's been fascinating at QFI as we've been doing for almost 10 years the work that we've been doing in US schools and now UK and Germany and schools in Qatar, and I'm talking K-12 schools, that there seem to be these individual lessons learned, right? You'll go to a wonderful school in Canada that has a fantastic ecosystem for dual language, English, Arabic, probably trilingual French. And we will take administrators from schools in New York City and Houston up there who are starting a dual language school so they can see what a robust ecosystem looks like. We've taken administrators from Qatar and teachers from Qatar out to California to work on something called an action collab. This is where you work for 3 days intensively with people you don't know on a big question, and you and your team come up with solutions. And it's directed at teachers to help them engage each other, learn from each other, and come up with practical solutions to some big problems that they face. So it's realistic. And not enough of that happens. I know my staff is going to be smiling and saying that's because you don't let us do it anymore. But not enough happens where you get that kind of cross-pollination. There's some great stories out there. There are some people doing amazing work. And it often needs that connective tissue for others to know about it. So I would say that one of the things that has to happen in the Gulf is more of that, and productively. Obviously, you're not just putting all of your teachers on planes to go to random conferences. Most teachers in Qatar, at least, I can't speak for the rest of the Gulf, complain that their professional development programs are unconnected, disconnected to the realities of teaching in their classrooms, and they would like better support and better structure to do that. So that's a very practical thing. And so beyond, global competency, better connecting success stories to people who are in classrooms so that they can actually learn from them and then have continuous support, whether it's online, in person, so that they get the support they need, their professional development is connected, and they get this opportunity to have some vision. Like look at the horizon and say, maybe I could try that in a year or two in my classroom, or I could try that in my school or in my ministry. And the third thing, and again, very specific to the Gulf and to the region, is Arabic. There's a problem, and it seems that it's only addressed at conferences. Well, we've heard about this problem because that's one of our core activities at QFI, is helping kids learn Arabic. But we're told, oh yeah, you help kids in America and the UK. They're not Arab kids. No, some of them are. And it turns out that Arabic is one language. And what you do is you differentiate instruction to different learners, whether they're heritage learners or not heritage learners. But it's one language. It is one beautiful, fantastic language. And the kids don't like learning it. And that's because the teachers are hired because they speak the language, not because they can actually teach the language. I've been a victim of this, and I have victimized others in Syria by teaching them English, and I had no right to be in that classroom teaching them English. Same problem. Your teachers have to love what they teach. And if the way they're teaching it is how they were taught, not all of that is bad. I'm not saying that all teachers from 50 to 60 years ago were not good teachers. I'm saying methods change, ways of teaching changes, and standing at the front of an Arabic classroom torturing people with grammar, and again, people on my staff love grammar. I don't understand. That may not be the best way to get your kids to love the language. I had a Qatari businessman, when he found out at a Qatar Foundation roundtable, about 2 years ago in Doha. And he asked me what I did, and I told him about our work. And he said, you need to bring this to Doha. My 4-year-old in the back of the car yesterday says, Baba, I hate my Arabic class. What 4-year-old should hate anything? 4-year-olds should go to school and love school. And if they don't love Arabic at 4, they're not going to love it at 14. So something has to change, and everyone in the Middle East should be able to speak, write, read Arabic with fluency. The literacy and numeracy is critical. And I would say that that is and has to be a focus. It is not a focus absent another focus, which is on other languages, and it brings me back, and I will conclude, going back to the global competency. It's not enough to have Arabic. But if they're not rooted in a solid appreciation of literacy and numeracy in Arabic, then acquiring a second language, again, refer to the reports and data and statistics, it's all there. Acquiring a second language is so much harder. So give them that language, give it right, give it well, student-centered classrooms where kids learn and they love to learn their own beautiful language, and then give them another language. And to me, if you do all that stuff, and it can be done, it's being done. And again, it gets back to that cohesive tissue. Take people to see other examples, bring it back, help make it manageable, help teachers, administrators, and government officials know and understand how to do that. It can be done. It can be done. And I think in this region right now, it must be done. Okay. And I'm done. Thank you.
So speaking of education, I would like to note that women in the Gulf are more educated than their male counterparts.
Yeah.
prime example, Dr. Auhoud Albulushi, with her PhD and 2 master's degrees. And she will be talking to you about gender issues in general in the Gulf region. I think she has a PowerPoint, and it's up.
Okay, thank you very much.
Wow.
Thank you, Dania, and thank you for inviting me to talk about this topic, which is close to my heart. And to set the record clear, my husband just got his PhD.
Does he have 2 masters?
Yeah. No, I got 1 master, but I was thinking about what people have been commenting on, because I've got my PhD back in 2003, and he did his master's then. We traveled together. And then later on, this year, he got his PhD and I got my master's, and we're graduating together in December. So it's not true. It's not true that women are more educated than men. More and more men are realizing the importance of education in the Gulf. And well, let me start my presentation today with a personal background about myself, just to give you a kind of an insider story. Well, I come from a large family, one of 12, 6 girls and 6 boys. The 6 girls, there's a large difference in age. So my eldest 2 sisters, who are maybe in their 60s, late 60s now, I hope they don't hear this. They haven't been to school. The eldest cannot read or write. The second one can read and write, but never managed to finish school. And the other 4 sisters were born end of the 60s, early 70s, including myself. Okay, now you know how old I am. We all benefited from provision of education in Oman. So the 4 sisters, 2 of them hold masters. One of them, she's finishing her PhD degree now, and myself. They're all married with kids. They all work. And this, I mean, it's not like, this is, you can see this story in many households in Oman and across the Gulf. The older generation, education was not available to them, women and men as well. But with the new generation, with the availability of education the past 4 decades, have opened up a lot for women and for men. So I'll start now with my presentation, okay? I'll go through a few different elements, and then we'll talk about the challenges and opportunities. Okay, what's that? Okay, so it's important to realize that women in the Gulf are not in one category. They come from different backgrounds. These backgrounds also mean that they have different challenges, they have different opportunities, and therefore it's important to move away from generalizations when defining women's in the Gulf or anywhere else, social, cultural, economic, legal, and political positions. And it's also important to move away from the portrayal of women in the Middle East and GCC as victims of male oppression based on religion and culture. As I was doing this PowerPoint, my daughter, who's just graduated as a lawyer, was reading with me, and she's like, I like this. Why do they keep saying we're oppressed? We're not. Anyway, the best approach is to examine women's concerns from their own perspective. And in fact, the best advocates for women in the Gulf are those women themselves. It is a fact that the GCC has seen significant progress in their efforts to support and empower women. Educating women was the most effective way to enhance the status of women in the Gulf in order to bridge the gender gap. Women in the GCC embraced those educational opportunities made available to them, and in some states, they are more educated than men, but not in Oman. And women in the GCC countries are exerting a positive influence in society and are moving away from the traditional confinement of family and home. However, a mixture of local norms and traditions emanating from patriarchal systems still exert pressure on women, limiting their opportunities in education, employment, and participation in the public sphere. So I was just trying to look at factors contributing to women's empowerment. So we have leadership and policies, modernization and globalization, education, professional development, employment. These are all factors that have contributed to empowering women in the Gulf, and I believe anywhere else as well. So the leadership in the GCC have supported women by providing the regulatory framework in terms of education for and employment rights for both men and women, raising society's awareness. Now, at the beginning, this was very difficult to convince families to send their daughters to school. I know this from many stories that we know about people that they refused to send their daughters at the beginning, but slowly, and they were convinced when they saw that everyone else is sending. So governments have worked hard in raising awareness that women education is not a threat. They also provide education opportunities, employment opportunities, and professional development. Now, political involvement has increased for both men and women in the Gulf. Public awareness of women issues has also increased. However, women are still insufficiently represented at the level of political decision-making. And this is also well known to government as well. They're trying to work around this. Now, women economic participation has also increased and contributed their financial independence. In fact, women are the main breadwinners in some households. And progression to senior posts can be more difficult for a variety of reasons, like glass ceiling, cultural perceptions. Also, the increased levels of academic qualifications among women in the GCC do not correspond with their share of decision-making positions or labor participation. Women's role in political and economic decision-making remains insufficient. Now, with the younger generation, as Kristin was saying, there is a shift, a cultural shift, and the use of multimedia, social media, and the internet. So the younger generation of women have higher expectations and demands in terms of public and political participation, as well as progression to senior posts. This is largely due to education, higher education abroad, globalization, internet, and popularity of social media among them. Now, if we move to the barriers, they're interconnected. So the social and cultural, the policy-related, some of the laws and regulations that need to be revised, reformed with, for example, family law. And we'll come later on to something else. And then there are some self-related ones. So we cannot all blame others, but we as women, we have to realize that we have to be active. We have to take it in our own hands. So some women are not motivated, they're inhibition, they're shy, or just don't want to work. To take these rights. They don't want to use them. So the current challenges are participation in decision-making, progression to senior leadership positions, adequate economic, political participation and representation, and then the reform of some laws and regulations. Okay, what can be done? There should be leadership commitment to political empowerment of women. And for example, having political awareness campaigns for women, introduction of quotas. I know some people don't like the idea of quotas, but in my opinion, this is the fastest and most effective way to start with. It's a top-bottom. So once it's there, once women have quotas and get into political positions, and they have the experience, then they can remove that or decrease it. Women must be active in pursuing their rights. You know, we can't just keep passive and wait for others to work for us. We have to work for that. And finally, the gradual development of women's position is a product of social and economic change and plays at the same time an important role in social development. The current gender gaps illustrate the different stages in transition within the GCC. So, as Kristin has said, and Maggie, it's a society that's in transition, that's changing. So the current gender gaps is just a different stage of transition that will change. And it's important to combine efforts by all stakeholders, policymakers, educationalists, families, individuals. We all have to work together in order to achieve the aims. Now, thank you very much for listening. I'll just leave you with this quote from Sultan Qaboos University in 2009, where he said that the country needs both men and women because it resembles a bird in relying on both its wings to fly high in the horizon of the sky. How can this bird manage if one of its wings is broken? Will it be able to fly? So this is how, at least in Oman, women participation is viewed. And actually tomorrow is Omani Women's Day, 17th of October. So
Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Albulushi. As we all probably can agree that initiatives for women should also come through policy-making environment, and I actually have seen that the Gulf governments try to implement policies to engage women, but also, as Auhoud mentioned, that it should be something from the grassroots level, meaning women should push for their own interests and their own rights. Segueing into that issue, Jane Kinninmont will be discussing women activism.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to speak about the factors that are in favor of women's activism in the Gulf countries, the factors that are currently constraining and opposing it, and then look a little bit at how women are in practice trying to navigate these things. And I'm defining activism quite broadly because I think in the current climate, for many women, the label of activist is something that they might shy away from. So I'm going to frame this more broadly as looking at the ways in which women in the Gulf are trying to negotiate positive social and maybe political change for women, but often trying to do it in quite a non-confrontational way, operating as they are in what are authoritarian political climates to greater or lesser degrees in each country. So I think everyone has made some really useful and important points, leaving me with little to say. But I very much agree, with two things actually that Dr. Auhoud said were things I wanted to mention at the very beginning, to say, there is not a single constituency of women who all want the same things in the Gulf. There are very live debates about the role of women in society. And one of the major factors that is in favour of greater activism by women as active citizens has been this massive expansion of women's education, something that is leading to a lot of bottom-up social change and is something that can't be reversed. And many of us looking at the Middle East have many reasons to be heavy-hearted at the moment. When I was at Chatham House, we used to have a contest each week, which never went anywhere, where our boss would say, can you find a good news story from the Middle East? And most weeks we couldn't. But I think one of the few major macro good news stories that is coming from the region is this massive change in the last generation in women's education. And that does mean changing expectations among women about the roles that they can have, particularly in the economy and to different degrees in society, politics, and the family as well. Secondly, there are economic changes underway that favour women's more active participation in job markets, because essentially from the government's perspective, you could no longer rely on oil to such a great extent in the future. You have to make more use of your human capital, and having spent so much on educating women, there's an economic rationale to enable them to be more active in the economy. That's something that we're seeing particularly dramatically in Saudi Arabia, because women's employment has historically been so low there. And in society as well, it's very common to hear people saying the cost of living has risen. We feel now that, my son needs a wife who will also bring in an income. And the social attitudes have changed, towards needing women to be out there in the workforce more. A third positive factor is that generally in the Gulf, and there's many caveats to this, but generally you have got leaders who have some sympathy towards improving women's empowerment and addressing some of the traditional gender inequalities. So, we saw the Kuwaiti emir giving women the vote. We saw the former Saudi king ensuring that women could be appointed to the Shura Council and to the government and so forth. And you've seen, I won't go into it too much more because we want to talk more about the women themselves, but you've seen a relatively welcoming stance from rulers in taking some steps to address these issues. But there are a lot of constraining factors as well, both from societies and from the leadership. So, yes, women are more educated. They are typically getting better degrees than men. And their improving job prospects also represent competition for men in a part of the world where there is significant unemployment and underemployment. And this gives rise to an economic rationale for conservatives to push back against the growing prominence of women in the economy, essentially seeing women as people who can steal their jobs. It's also very disruptive to family relationships, in a way, if there are more opportunities for women to become financially independent and potentially exert other forms of independence. So, of course, when you have this kind of dramatic social change, there is pushback. Political Islam, and even against democracy, portraying themselves as the defenders of women and minorities, and suggesting that more democracy would set that back. That is not totally without justification. I remember after Mohamed Morsi was elected in Egypt, there was the strange situation where Egypt had fewer women in its parliament than Saudi Arabia, as they had abolished their quota for women that they previously had in Egypt, and Saudi Arabia had 20% appointed women in parliament. And this is one of the issues that women have to deal with, is there's often also tensions between some women who want to embrace the package offered by some of the rulers in the Gulf, where there's social liberalism but no political freedom, and others would see their interests more in civil rights than in women's rights as women. So there are a lot of tensions there. And in the last 7 years, since the Arab uprisings, there has been greater pressure on civil society in general across the Gulf countries. There has been a shrinking of space. There has been a squeezing of that margin for people to talk about things they'd like to change without being seen as enemies of the state. And this is something, very damaging and very destructive to a Gulf that has invested so much in educating people, supposedly fostering critical thinking, sending students around the world to learn from best practice everywhere. But everyone is very conscious that when you exercise those things, it's also highly risky. And typically, women who have been campaigning on women's issues have not been at the forefront of the groups that have come under suspicion. But you have seen, over the past year, particularly with the very prominent arrests of women's driving activists in Saudi Arabia, that women can also be a target. The Saudi media and others that are closely allied with Saudi Arabia in the Gulf have been quick to demonize these well-known women activists as foreign agents and part of a larger conspiracy, showing the risks that can arise when people are working on even very local issues like the women's driving ban, an issue that the government itself was happy to address. But when they are speaking out and seen internationally, it's all too easy for them to be seen today as a security threat. And I think over the past few years, because of this context, I think there are fewer and fewer women in the Gulf who want to identify themselves as a women's activist. And there's even a shrinking away from the discourse of human rights. You do see some very prominent human rights activists, especially in Bahrain, where politics is more contentious than anywhere in the Gulf, and in Kuwait, which has allowed more of a tradition of civil society and critical discussion to flourish. But for many women who I talk to who are trying to advance discussion on certain issues, they would say, we don't want to use that language of human rights. That will get us problems with the government, and it will bring us problems from the traditionalists in society as well, who see in their minds human rights as being Western and an attack on Islam. So, I was interested in hearing one Saudi woman, for instance, describing the art of zigging and zagging, seeing obstacles and not confronting them, but just finding the ways to get around them and the language and the discourses that would work. Similarly, a young Kuwaiti activist working on domestic violence issues described it as being a dance. You're working out where the others are moving and, again, trying to move around them. This particular issue of domestic violence has been one where there has been quite extensive campaigning, especially in Kuwait and in Saudi Arabia. And to quite a large extent in Saudi Arabia, it has been led by people from the medical profession who have sought to portray this as a public health issue. People are also very aware that one of the ways that you can frame a desire for certain social changes constructively is to look at economic development and to look at the very real evidence that exists about domestic violence against women and children holding people back in terms of their future economic productivity, of course, much more widely in their ability to kind of realise themselves, but certainly in terms of what they can achieve in education and in the economy. In Kuwait, by contrast, where the discourse is less focused on the economy, campaigners who are looking at violence issues tend to frame their discussion in terms of development, national dignity, nationalist narratives, to say, Kuwait has been a leader in so many ways. Shouldn't we also be a leader in addressing this issue? And it becomes an issue of national pride, precisely to distance themselves from accusations that people who bring up dirty laundry are somehow undermining the state. Another of the issues that women across the Gulf have highlighted has been the inequality in terms of passing on citizenship to your children, as typically women who marry foreign men cannot then pass citizenship to their children. And that's been another area of lobbying and campaigning where women activists across the Gulf have all been dealing with the same issue and basically swapping notes on how to campaign on it. It's become increasingly more difficult, though, for women to campaign at a Gulf-wide level because of the tensions between among the Gulf states, and then the potential risks of being associated with women from other countries who, until recently, were your friends, neighbours, brothers, and part of the common GCC. There are also, of course, economic empowerment is a big focus of women who are being active in trying to develop female entrepreneurs, networks, mentoring, social enterprise, and that being very much something that is generally welcomed by states, as long as it's empowerment framed in terms of economic empowerment of women, then that is a discourse about social change that is still relatively unrisky and welcome. But there are also some tensions in between activists who are focusing on the economic empowerment of female nationals who are generally fairly well off, and those much smaller minority of activists who do work on behalf of migrant women, and the many difficulties that they face, who are living in almost a different world within these same very small countries. So I see that women working on all these issues are working in a very difficult and restrictive environment for civil society at large, but that they are also finding very interesting ways of operating within those constraints. And I don't see it as something that is going to stop, falter, or run out of steam. I see it as being something that is really coming from the bottom up, as a result of having women that are so much better educated than in the past and have so much access to information and to international experiences. That is not to say that it's all new. It would be wrong to imagine that women were always powerless and that this is only suddenly changing. But there are definitely new tools and abilities that women across the Gulf are availing themselves of. And just finally, I'd like to really thank the organisers for having a panel that looks at this issue. One of my Saudi friends always laments what he sees as people discussing the Gulf purely in terms of princes and petrol. And I think it's been wonderful to have this discussion that looks much more at the society and the things that are too often overlooked in the Western focus. Thank you.
And we are very grateful to have panelists such as these ladies to highlight some of the critical issues related to women and youth in the Gulf. There is one point that I would like to highlight, and it's one endemic characteristic of cultural societies or collective societies in general, in which everybody's involved in everybody's business, and that can lead to a lot of issues that are different than what you kind of face here in the West. And I know I've been a little tough on men, so to balance this out, I will say that I can attest that some of the challenges to women getting some of their goals or attaining some of their goals are not coming from their male counterparts. It is coming from female elements in the society that want to maintain the patriarchal culture. And I found that a complaint among many young Gulf women that are, I guess, female and youth. So we have a set of questions in regards to various issues. That was just one point. I know I shouldn't talk as a moderator, but I had to say it. Okay. So I'm going to go ahead and get into the questions because we're running short on time. And then each one of you will have 2 minutes, and you can answer which question you would like to address. So I will start now. Do you think the less political participation of women in the Gulf is a result of government policies or societal pressure, or possibly the normal trend towards development? Do you think women's rights are universal or subject to cultural norms? And how has the younger leadership in the Gulf influenced their large youthful populations politically, economically, and socially? Please forgive me, I'm trying to read through these questions, but some of us have doctor handwriting, so if I kill your question, don't be upset. Okay. Dr. Najma Al-Zij... I know I killed Al-Zij... Okay, Az-Zijali, Georgetown University, Sultan Qaboos University. What is the change that you have witnessed in young women at Sultan Qaboos University from the time you started teaching till now, if any, good or bad? I'm pretty sure who... Yes, obviously. That is for you. Okay, another question. Do Gulf governments see women's employment as an economic asset and multiplier, or as a social political issue that must be dealt with? Okay, another question. We've heard a lot about women and youth, but what about female youth? Is there a way to engage them in this discussion? And there is a concern in the US about women outperforming young men. This was not me, okay. Could this also be an issue in the Gulf over time? Yeah. Boys are in the skylines on the Corniche versus sisters studying at home. I think there's a little bias in the question, but we can go ahead and pose it. So I will give each panelist 2 minutes to give kind of their closing remarks and answer some of these key questions, starting with Dr. Diwan.
Speed talk.
You want me to reverse it?
Fine either way.
Okay, Dr. Auhoud.
Ready to go, maybe.
Okay. Well, the change I've seen in women in SQU, well, when I started teaching at Sultan Qaboos University back in, I think, 1996 or 7, there were very few Omani academics. I remember going into the classroom and they'll think I'm one of the students. And it was, at the beginning it was funny, and then it got very frustrating. And I was getting into the classroom and when I come in for the first class, they'll be, what? And it's a mixed class, so it's, boys and girls, as co-education in Sultan Qaboos University. So yes, it was frustrating because they wouldn't really, I felt they wouldn't really respect me because, okay, I'm Omani and I look young. And, but the good thing was I was a role model for many girls. I mean, each one in each semester, I would have students coming to me, female students, saying that you inspire us. Okay, we never thought. I mean, we were thinking of pursuing a career in education and teaching at university, and now I see girls everywhere. And I look at them, it's like, when I was their age, I didn't have the courage, I didn't have those skills, I didn't have this. I don't know how to say it. It's like I wish I was born in this generation. I would be much different. I mean, until now, I find it hard to talk in public. I mean, believe it or not. But I look at my daughter. I mean, again, they benefited a lot from not only education, from having educated families and parents. Many families send their children, both boys and girls, to private schools, where also, I'm not saying that they all should, but they teach them certain kinds of skills and outlook to this is what Maggie was saying, is how to deal, how to be creative, how to work as a team. All these things that our generation, yes, we had education, but it was not the kind of education that I would love. I mean, I would love this kind of education that the new generations are having. So the girls are everywhere. Yes, we have some challenges, we have some things, but I mean, the road is there. I mean, all they have to do is just seize the opportunities and work and be active and not just wait for things to be given to them. And I think this is what also the government in Oman is trying to instill in women, is that you go for it. Don't just wait. We've done what we have to do. Now it's your turn. And I'm very proud of how the new generations of Omani women are becoming. Yeah.
Okay, Maggie? Going out of order, sorry.
Well, no, that's okay. I don't know. I think the growing up in and not an Arab family, both last names are acquired. So I've always felt sort of an affinity for Arab families and for actually Southwest Asian families, because when you grow up in a conservative Christian household, first generation to go to college, you also have some of the same conditions where everyone's in your business, and I think Ambassador Theros understands the Greek equivalent. Everyone's in your business. No one understands why the girl is going off to college. And this was in 1985, and I was going from New York to Baltimore. So it wasn't all that far. So I have sort of an appreciation of both the challenge and also that when you do that dance or that zigzag, you can get there. It may be not direct, and sometimes I prefer direct, but you can also have a reasonable accommodation, which may sound terrible and may sound like you're sacrificing something, but there is also a social fabric, and social fabrics are important. And it's hard to understand how much you can stress one. For you personally and for every person, I think that's an individual choice, and so women and men need to be left to some degree with that choice, while maybe people around them can be, people like me who can certainly not speak for this community, try to be supportive in ways that are supportive. So I love the idea, and I've loved it since my first trip to Saudi Arabia, and well, my first trip was, I guess, in '99, but real trip to Saudi Arabia in 2003 and 4, when, surprise, surprise, there was actually reform going on. It's amazing it wasn't invented in the past 2 years. And watching women press to be part of the Jeddah Economic Forum, watching women push and really tug at that social fabric in a way that was authentic to them and in different degrees. There were women pushing back. There was a real conversation. And to me, as an outsider, the best I could do was be there and watch it and tell my part of the world, you know, they're doing this. We don't need to say any particular thing about women, and maybe there are ways that we can be supportive, but first we take our cues from them and not impose our own idea of what that should look like because we think we're right. And that sort of, I don't know, there's fancy academic words for it, but I just call it bigotry. It is kind of it's a chauvinism, like I am better than you, and I'm not, and who am I to say? So I think that's really exciting. I've really loved watching it and trying to help where I could, usually privately with young women or women who were my age that were trying to do something, and also trying to tell that story. I mean, to me, this goes back to the previous panel, the media is so important to telling authentic stories. When you have photojournalists that are trying to go to Saudi Arabia to capture some of the images of women and trying to help them do that, because you know that those images are going to create dissonance in people's minds, that this uniform idea that they had is maybe not so real, actually. And there is a lot of poverty, and there are a lot of women who need help, and they need help all over the world. And seeing that, as opposed to seeing one part of the world that is apparently the only one that's victimizing its women, I think is unhealthy. So I don't actually know that that answered any of the questions. So that's what I think, though. And then wrapping it, I think I'm done.
Okay, Jane?
Thanks. Is it society or leaders who are presenting the obstacles? It always has to be both. If you're looking at the position of women in the society, economy, and in the family, then everyone is a stakeholder in that. But I also think that governments are often passing the buck and being disingenuous when they say we cannot do any more because the society wants it this way. So, for instance, they could, at a stroke, change the laws about citizenship and passing citizenship on to your children, especially at a time when many Gulf governments are worried about diminishing numbers of citizens in their population. They could be tougher on prosecuting domestic abusers, making it easier for women to, if they want to go that far, to escape abusive relationships and have safe places to go. They could be appointing women to cabinets, which some of them have done, but they could be doing that on a bigger scale and to jobs that are beyond, social development or women's education or so forth. I remember a wonderful exchange that we had at Chatham House in an on-the-record event where I had the pleasure of chairing a discussion with the Saudi Foreign Minister, Adel Jubeir, and he was taken on by a very articulate and active young Saudi scholar who was in the audience, because he had said the society was against women driving. And she said, but, Mr. Foreign Minister, if I go home and I drive, it will not be the society that arrests me. And of course, within 2 years, that driving ban was lifted. Women are now driving. And guess what? The sky did not fall in. It was possible to make that change, but for many, many years we heard the argument that it was impossible. And it's partly because when you're talking about society, there is a question of who you are listening to in society. I mean, in Kuwait, it appeared that the society was against women voting because the men who represented society in the parliament naturally didn't want women to be competing against them as candidates. Even one woman winning would mean that one of them would be out of a fairly lucrative and empowering job. But once that change happened, women were voting. Women were also often not voting for women. Several women were voted into the parliament and most of them were voting back out. And men began to realise, oh, these might be people that can support me. This is great. So I think there is much more that can be done at the leadership level, in a part of the world where leaders really do set a great deal of the public narrative and the direction of travel. Thanks.
Okay. Thank you. Everyone give them a round of applause. Oh my God. Dr. Diwan, I'm so sorry. It's been a long, long day.
It's fine.
She'll get an extra round of applause.
This is what happens when you're not as quick on your feet and you get skipped over, so then you get skipped over. I'll just comment on two of the questions that were asked. One about the combination of youth and women. It's an interesting question, and I was thinking about it, reflecting on it, and it's really striking, actually, that whether you look at the bottom-up illustration of that, which would be kind of political activists, because I'm talking on the political side here, or the top-down, the more state-led change, women have played a super prominent role in both, which is really telling, I think, again, and goes to what all of the panelists said and what Jane said as well about this moment of really women coming out in the Gulf. I mean, the most prominent activists in Bahrain and in Saudi Arabia were women in the political movements that took place in like 2011 to 2014. And the same, again, when you look at the change that's being driven by states as they want to see kind of shifts in their society, both for economic reasons. I think the need, especially in a country like Saudi Arabia, to engage half the population when you need to really have, the economy expand. I mean, you look at Vision 2030, it explicitly says that it wants to, I can't remember the number, I think 20%, it wants to more than double the amount of women that are on the workforce, because that's one way to really quickly increase kind of economic growth and participation. And also for political reasons, wanting to see a certain shift in society, perhaps away from some sort of more Islamist base in some of these societies in particular. You're seeing the appointment of a lot of women now through, ministries, women ministers, young women ministers. I know in the UAE they have a minister of youth. I forgot her name, something Al-Mazroui, I think. She was only like 23 years old. So, I mean, really putting these people out front, at least for a face for society, can form this kind of shift in the way that people think about women in the public space. As far as the young leadership, I've thought about this a lot too, and it's also a big element of this generation transition in the Gulf. It's not just within society, it's also in leaders. And I actually wrote a paper about this, thinking about what that shift means. And that's where it's also sort of a very critical moment in terms of the politics, because we're just at this very key moment where if you look like in Saudi Arabia, actually the very first time we're seeing the leadership move from the sons of the founder to the grandsons. I mean, this is a really pivotal political shift with enormous ramifications within the family, obviously, for who is going to hold power and all of the benefits that go with that. And I think it's kind of structurally makes sense then that we would have all of this kind of tremendous kind of change and a difficult transition in Saudi Arabia in that kind of moment. It's also really striking then that when you get a shift in generations, you see a lot of this kind of greater ambition. I think naturally people want to make a mark, kind of showing that they're doing something new. We saw this with when King Hamad took over in Bahrain. We saw it as Sheikh Mohammed has taken leadership in the UAE. We saw it also in Qatar. So we see kind of big, more national projects that take place, and that also leads to greater competition. So that's something also that the Gulf has had to deal with as you've had these younger leaders doing that. And it's also striking then, as you get new generation that are more in tune with the kind of things that motivate the generation, then you do get this shift in attention to the arts, to media. And it's really striking that you see a young leader like Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia actually basing his political constituency on a youth constituency. I mean, because he's shifting from the old pillars of power to actually really appealing to youth as a key part of his entire leadership. So I think we're going to have to be looking at this new generation of women taking more of a public role, of young people. What are the consequences of that, both within society and within the leadership, is something that the Gulf is going to be kind of digesting and working through at the same time that we here in Washington have to figure out how to engage with those people in different ways too.
Yes, and I would like to know on top of that, I mean, the social change that has occurred in the Gulf these last few years is huge. I mean, if you look at the Western world, how long it took to get women's rights. I mean, these states were founded, let's say, 60s and 70s? So, I mean, I know there's a lot of area for improvement, and we cannot deny that. But if you look at where the Gulf countries started and where they are today with regards to women and the involvement of youth, I mean, there's a huge difference. And closing on this note, now we can give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much.